Okay, so this is being recorded now. So thanks everyone for joining. This is a joint webinar from HDR UK, Edinburgh, Scotland, and SCADR. For people who don't know me, I'm Hong Han Wu. I'm one of the co-directors of Health Data Research UK Scotland site. My day job is, a professor at University of Glasgow. Yes, our great honor to have two speakers today to talk about exciting research and the resources of SCADA. So I'm going to give a brief introduction about these two speakers. Then we allow Iain to kick off the presentation and the introduction of ADR Scotland. So Iain Atherton is a co-director of SCADR, which is one of the node of the whole UK-wide administrative network, data network. Iain is a professor of nursing data science at Edinburgh Napier University with expertise in population health and has previously worked in clinical nursing practice. Iain leads the health and social care research program at SCADA. I guess I probably pronounced this wrong. I'm sure Iain will correct me later. And which is, he's interested in care provision in the context of aging population. I believe it's very, very timely research in terms of aging population across the world. A major focus of his work is developing understanding of nursing and midwifery professions from a social science perspective using linked datasets. We have our second speaker, Dr. Robert Porter, SCADR researcher, and Robert is a research lead at the Center of Excellence for Children's Care and Protection and leads SCADR's research project on kinship care. And he's a socio-legal researcher with an interest in the experiences of children, the young people who have care experience. Primarily, he is interested in the ways that administrative data can enhance our understanding of care journeys and outcomes. Welcome, both of you, and the floor is yours, Iain.
Thank you very much. So let me just give you a little overview of how Robert and I are going to, I really appreciate, I should say, that welcome and that overview, and just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about HDR Scotland. I speak for myself, and I think I speak for Robert as well. So what Robert and I will do is, I'm going to just spend 5 minutes or so talking about ADR Scotland, what it's about, sort of how it works. A quarter of an hour talking about one of my projects. As Hong Yang highlighted, I lead the health and social care element, and the nursing professions, midwifery professions, very close to my heart as a registered nurse. So I'll tell you about that specific project as much as anything to give you indication as to how HDR Scotland works, how it achieves its aims. I'll then hand over to Robert, who'll spend a quarter of an hour or so talking about his work on looked after children. And then we've left plenty of time at the end for questions. I think Hong Yang's going to facilitate that. You can put questions in the chat bar or put your hand up at that point. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about ADR Scotland. ADR Scotland is one of 4 nodes or centres around the UK. Each of the home countries has its own. We bring together academics from a number of universities, as well as people with policy expertise from Scottish Government. And we have some key partners that are highlighted on this slide. EPCC, who hold data securely and crucial to enabling that research. EDRIS, who coordinate projects, not just for us, but more widely, likewise EPCC. National Records of Scotland, who are so key to so many of the statistics held in Scotland, the census, for example. and Research Data Scotland, a relatively new organisation which really pushing forward good governance but also timely access to data. So number of entities that come together. I think a key thing about us is that our goal is to facilitate research that uses administrative data, routinely collected data, in ways that is policy relevant, and that is to the public benefit, and that with secure good governance. So it really is about trying to encourage the use of routinely collected data, which is relatively new beyond health research in the UK. So within the Scottish Centre, we have the Scottish Centre for Administrative Data Research, which is a key component of ADR Scotland, it's kind of the academic element. And we have 6 areas in which we work. As mentioned, my specific area is health and social care, but you'll see that there are others. It covers a wide range of policy areas. As I mentioned, governance is so key to what we do, that the data is held securely, that it is handled in a way that is ethical and meets legal requirements, so that the risk of disclosure is absolutely minimized. And essentially, we follow a set of principles originally developed by the Office for National Statistics, the 5 safes, as we call them. Essentially, you can see these 5 safes on the slide in front of you just now. Essentially, what they do is they ensure that the data is securely held, that it can be accessed by people who are knowledgeable about the use of this data, the secure use of this data, the ethical use of this data, and that the only thing that is ever released from safe settings are tables that are highly aggregated, so that individuals cannot be identified within those tables or those statistical models. So governance absolutely key to what we do. So that's a very brief overview of ADR Scotland. Our fellow centres in the rest of the UK, each of us operates in slightly different ways, but essentially it's the same principles that we're working to and the same goals that we work to. We work very closely together. So with that overview in mind, let me give you a little example of a project which I think in many respects typifies the challenges of using this data and why what we are doing in ADR Scotland and the wider ADR UK network is just so important. Scandinavia, other countries, New Zealand, have quite a long history of using routinely collected data and linking it together in ways so that policy can be more evidence informed. In the UK, until about 10 years ago, that tradition was much less, really focused on health data. So sort of pet project of mine, which started probably about 10 years ago in the early stages of the ADR system. I started having talks with the Nursing and Midwifery Council to start thinking about how we might use the data that they hold in ways that could help inform them and others as to policy around the nursing profession. I suspect that most of you are well aware that nursing and perhaps to a lesser extent, but nonetheless still notably, midwifery are facing significant challenges, and the headlines that I've pasted onto the slide in front of you just gives you a taste for some of those. So concerns about recruitment, currently places to nursing programs are not being filled. There's concerns about retention, about short staffing. Around about 50% of, my understanding is around about 50% of vacancies are currently being filled from overseas. So real shortage of nurses within the UK. And I think one of the challenges there is that for a long time, we've not really had great data to really inform our policy. So I say it's close to my heart. When I qualified, well, actually, let me move on to the next slide. I mean, one of the challenges is that, yes, we have all these challenges with recruitment, but we also have pockets and these periods of time where we have the opposite problem. We have more nurses being qualified than there are places to fill. And this particular screenshot is quite a recent one. It's taken from last year from Glasgow. And it really is not a new problem. When I registered some 30 years ago, I couldn't find a job. It took me 6 months. Eventually, I had to move from the Highlands down to the south of England in order to find a post. And yet within a couple of years, the trust I was working for was having to go to Finland and the Philippines to recruit. We were desperately short-staffed, posts not filled. So these are not new problems. As I say, I think one of the challenges has been the data and thus evidence to inform recruitment policy has been limited. The thing is that data has largely existed, but the ability to access it, the capacity, the research capacity, the ability to link across information sources has just not been there. So I started having discussions with the Nursing and Midwifery Council. The Nursing and Midwifery Council are responsible for registering anybody who meets the requirements to practice as a nurse or midwife across the whole of the UK. So health is a devolved policy area, but even so, when it comes to the registration of nurses, that remains UK-wide. So Nursing and Midwifery Council have a record, and a live record, which is constantly updated as to who meets those criteria. You can go online, you can type my name in, and from the screenshot here, you can see that I am a registered nurse. And that is actually really powerful data. We have to revalidate every 3 years. And when we revalidate, we update the information held by the Nursing and Midwifery Council. So when you link that data together, you actually end up with a longitudinal data set that shows you that as a basis potentially for analysis to better understand who's coming onto the register, how long do they remain on that register, at what points do they drop off, does it differ from one part of the UK to another? So even on its own, once you start using it creatively, there is the potential to really begin to much better understand the dynamics of the nursing profession. You can see from the slide in front of you the kinds of variables that are held. You can see the dates that look somewhat perhaps slightly surprising. There is a reason for these, for why these dates have been chosen. It is now being transferred annually. So we also have 2023 data, and I think shortly we'll have 2024 data. But I'll tell you a little bit more about how that data is being held in a few moments. So that data on its own is very powerful, but it's also fairly limiting. So it's a little bit about socio-demographics, a little bit about professional dimensions, how long a person's been registered, some additional qualifications. So quite valuable. It tells us that they've been registered, but there's a lot that it doesn't tell us. And this is where data linkage, and I think the work more widely of the ADR network is so valuable, because I suspect most of you are health researchers, and we know that health, the big determinants of health are not actually to be found within the health sector. They're to be found within economics, within education, within housing. So actually research to really understand what's going on benefits when you start linking across sectors. And what we've done with the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and working very closely with the Office for National Statistics, which is the kind of UK-wide data and statistics organisation, is that we've worked with them to bring the Nursing and Midwifery Council register, a slice of it every March, into what is now their integrated data service, which is kind of secure area where data can be held and securely accessed. So we worked with them to bring that data into the integrated data service, and there they within that area they have linked to the census for England and Wales for 2021. And in front of you, you can see a census form, and you can see some indication of the kinds of data that's held there. And I'll flag up one or two there. So, for example, it gives indication of caring responsibilities. I suspect that nurses, with population aging and responsibilities towards childcare, but also towards care of older people, I suspect that nurses may have particular challenges with our expectations, perhaps more expectations on them than in amongst the general population towards providing unpaid care. Is that true? We don't know. But by linking data and making data available, we can start to understand if that's so. Potential policy benefits. If we understand the problem, we can start to think about, well, what can we do in order to overcome that problem? Perhaps more pertinent, given the work that our initial projects, occupation. So Michelle Jameson, I'll talk a little bit more about her in a few moments, but she's looking at nurses' occupation. Just because somebody is on the register does not necessarily mean that they're working as a nurse or a midwife. In fact, we suspect that many are working in other areas, or indeed not working at all. So once you start linking across sectors, linking especially to the census, then you can start to ask questions that previously you just couldn't using nationally representative data. The integrated data service is very powerful because this is the area where large UK government data sets are being held and nationally representative surveys. It's relatively in its early days. In fact, this is the first, our nurses project is the first linked data set to be moved into the integrated data service. And Michelle and I are amongst the first academics to be making use of that facility. So this is all very early stages moving forward and really developing the capacity of the UK in order to use linked data. So in front of you just now, you can see an infographic that my colleagues in ADR UK created that explains visually, concisely, explains the NMC census England and Wales 2021 dataset. You can find this on the particular web page, ADR UK web page. An important element of this work is that we are taking forward some initial studies using that data, but others can, as long as they are recognized as accredited researchers and they pass through stringent governance, which is quite streamlined and relatively straightforward to take forward. But the key point is this is not just about the work that my colleagues and I are doing. This is about research that potentially others, data that potentially others can utilize. So yeah, it's using the integrated data service, which has a number of data sets and has the flexibility that data can be linked relatively straightforwardly. So in terms of timely access to data, which has often been a challenge in the past, even where data has been available, I think ONS integrated data service, and in Scotland, much of the work that's being done as well, is really facilitating that. One of our projects we started our permissions for, once the data is actually in place, we started permissions for, and from starting those permissions to having data available, we were talking a matter of weeks. So it's a relatively sleek system. Still governance very much to really good governance to before. So as the integrated data service, you can find that online. There are currently quite a large number of data sets already available in there, and it's being added to all the time. So in the last few minutes I've got, let me just very quickly touch upon those initial studies. Michelle Jameson, she's looking at occupations. She's using information from the census to look at what jobs are nurses actually doing, how many are actually in clinical practice. We suspect that there's quite a lot of people on the register who, for a whole host of reasons, one being that they can't get jobs when they qualify, may well be doing engaged in other occupations. So Michelle is looking at that and what the drivers are behind occupational choice. And then with a fellowship that I have, and huge thanks to ADR UK for that, I'm looking at migration patterns. So for example, nurses that move from Scotland or Northern Ireland to London, we often predicate nursing policy at a kind of a UK level, whereas actually we think that there are situations where there's some parts of the UK where there's lots of nurses who qualify and then, like I did 30 years ago, end up moving to other parts of the UK. So trying to have a better understanding of the nuances of the nursing and midwifery workforces, again, with policy relevance. Some 800,000 nurses, the key to the work of the health service, so understanding it really, really important. So I'm just about to run out of time. Let me just close by saying a huge thank you to the Economic and Social Research Council, whose funding enables this, and ADR UK and ADR Scotland for all their support, and clearly to the Office for National Statistics and the Nursing Midwifery Council. I couldn't name many others. Huge thanks to them for enabling this work. So at that point, I'll hand over to yourself, Robert. I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much, Iain. I will share mine. The inevitable bit where everybody fiddles with their technology until it works. So hopefully, I hope that this does the trick for you. Could I get a thumbs up or something? Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. So hi everybody, my name's Robert Porter, and I'd like to tell you about a piece of work that I did along with a colleague who's in the audience, Dr. Joanna Sorokin, which involved some linkage of health data to social care data. And it was a project called Growing Up in Kinship Care, which, as you might expect, looked at experiences of young people growing up in kinship care through the administrative data that we hold on them. So first, just to say, for those who, many of you are probably familiar, but just in case, kinship care is where a child or a young person lives with and is looked after by a friend or relative rather than their a friend or a member of their extended family rather than their parents. In our instance, we are thinking about formal kinship care, which is to say where that arrangement is in place, but that child is looked after by the local authorities. So that child is a looked after young person. And we were doing this research because, as Iain said, we're really focused on policy-driven research, which can tell us about the impact of policy or inform policy developments. There has been a significant push towards kinship care in recent years. So it is now the first preferred option when a child or young person can't live with their parents is for them to live in kinship care with extended family or friends. And as you can see from the infographic, which comes as a result of this research, that number rose from about 1 in 6 in 2008 through to 1 in 3 in 2019. So it's so doubling essentially, and that's a really steady increase. And also because we had a shortage of evidence regarding what were the experiences of young people, children and young people in formal kinship care. So we looked to link data from a variety of sources. The two which I'll be talking about most in this presentation are those two in red circles. So the children looked after statistics and the health visiting data, or I think the health surveillance data is also what it's called. But we also linked to education data, to child protection data, and also to the SCRA data, which is the Scottish Children's Reporter Administration data, which is about children's hearings. So we linked a really wide range of data in this project. So the purposes of this project were twofold. Firstly, as I say, to find out about those experiences, to understand more about the experiences of children and young people in terms of their health, education, child protection, experiences of the hearing system through the administrative data that we hold on them. But there was also a second objective, which was testability of the to understand specific these experiences of specific cohorts, and to examine, well, what were we able to do with that data, and how could we what could we learn from it? So in this context, I want to talk about the linkage that we undertook between health and class data. So class, the children looked after statistics. And I think the title of this presentation was Findings and Challenges. Realistically, it's going to be challenges and then some findings. So challenges first. And what we were doing was requesting this data from both of these data sets. So the children's social work statistics has a longitudinal data set. So as Iain was talking about with the nursing and midwifery, the nursing registration, sorry, there is a similar data set for the children's looked after statistics, which runs from 2008 and is being constantly updated now. And that was our definitional cohort. So we were looking for any children and young people in that data set who had experienced formal kinship care. And those were the children and young people that we tried to find link data for. And from that data set, we also collected a lot of data in relation to their experiences. So their placement, so when they were looked after, where they were looked after, by who, the legal reasons that they were undertaken, and so forth. And there were 21 data items that we got from that, but many of those were repeated across across multiple placements. So of course, every placement has a placement type, etc., and so forth. In the health visitor data, we linked to 5 different instances of data being collected. And if you've had a child in the last kind of, well, 10 years or so, then you'll be familiar with some of this. So in the first few days of a child returning home, there is a first visit by a health visitor, then a 6 to 8 week review, 13 to 15 month, 20 to 30, and 4 or 5 year review. And in these points, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's data collected on the child's development, on any developmental concerns that might be arise, the physical growth, things like that. And a lot of that is obviously coded, and we were requesting 86 data items from that to really try and get a grip with, to get as much information as we could around it. So just to get, what we're going to talk about now is that initial data linkage and what happened. So from the class cohort, we were able to link 19, well, I say we, National Records of Scotland, on our behalf, were able to link 19,077 children from that cohort of children and young people who'd experienced kinship care to the SPINE cohort used to link the other data sets. Now, when we started linking in the other data sets, actually only 12,000, well, nearly 13,000 of those were able to be linked to any other source. So that includes the education, the child protection, the SCRA data. And in fact, only a quarter were able to be linked to any of the child health data, which is obviously not what we want to see. So we were initially, we'd had some indication that this might be the case, but this was obviously not our desired outcome. So that was initially a big challenge, of course, that only a quarter of the children that we were able to link could get any health data. And that's not to say it had all of those time points, but any of those time points. And so when we looked at, or got the report more detailed about those time points, you can see the appointments down the left there, the different points at which a health visitor was visiting, and they do specific hearing and vision tests, which are held separately, which is why those are listed there. The number of children from the cohort in the data set, so they are generally in the thousands, which is, you know, not too terrible, I suppose. But actually, when we started looking at, well, how many of these children were in or had experienced kinship care at the point that this data was being collected, those numbers dropped hugely, as you can see, down into double figures for most of them, and with the exception of the vision test, which actually makes up a massive proportion of the data that we actually got for that. Just to clarify, the 13 to 15 month visit, the reason we don't have any data for that is because that was only collected from 2017. That was when it was starting to be collected. And as I'll come on to talk about, children under the age of 5 were effectively unable to be linked to this data set. So the big crosses and ticks there show where we were able actually to do some analysis, because as you can see, the percentage of children with data relating to the period during or after kinship care is really small in many of these, and meant that we weren't able to do any analyses that we wanted using that data. So we were really restricted to that 27-30 4 to 5 year and vision test data to actually do any analyses on. So why was that? And as I indicated there, the primary challenge in this context is the reliance on the Scottish candidate number to facilitate linkage to the spine. Now, the Scottish candidate number is essentially a school registration number, which is given to a child, or a child gets it, or however you want to frame that, at around when they start school, so round about the age of 4 or 5 years old. And what that means, of course, is that any young person who is under the age of 5 at the point that your data is being collected, or that you're collecting your data rather, that it's not able to be effectively linked to the spine. So we lacked a lot of data for children and young people under the age of 5. Additionally, the nature of our cohort, we were interested, obviously, as I said, the definitional cohort for us was children and young people who had experienced formal kinship care. And their care record is, of course, that's where it's recorded. But if they only ever experienced being looked after under the age of 5, that record was never updated with the SCN that they would subsequently receive. And so if they only experience care under the age of 5, then they would also not have a Scottish candidate number linked to that record, and so that would not be able to be linked to the spine effectively. And then additionally, of course, there is incomplete or inaccurate recording across all data sets, which is just the natural effects of manual data entry, which most of this is at some point, or all of it is at some point. Which mean that, of course, you know, if a postcode is entered inaccurately, or a date of birth or something like that, then that can cause clashes, which mean that they're not linked to the spine effectively. In addition, we had other specific challenges with some of the data we were looking at. So as I've alluded to, some of the available data, some of the data that we were looking for was available at very different periods of time. So some of it available from 2011, some from 2013, and some from 2017. So that really meant that there wasn't a consistent set of data across the period of time, and that there was for some children and young people, the only effective data that we had was that vision data. So what that creates in total is something that looks like this. So the purple line here is the linkage rate. And across the bottom, you've got the date of birth, or year of birth, sorry, of the children and young people. And you see that it starts out very well for what are the older children and young people at the point that our data stopped. And, you know, close to 90% matching rate, but then dropping off as they get younger and younger. And then actually from the under the age of 5, an effective linkage rate of pretty much 0. So that's a significant challenge, obviously, and particularly in our context, because children and young people who are under the age of 5 make up a significant portion of the children and young people who become looked after, and are a group of that we had a particular interest in finding out about their experiences. So that was really unfortunate for us. So having talked about some of the challenges, I will show you now some of the findings that we were able to do in relation to health work. And just to give some context, that rise in the number of children and young people who are looked after in formal kinship care is alongside a decline for those looked after at home, while everything else remains roughly roughly stable in the proportions, although there is an overall decline in the total number of children and young people who are looked after. So what we were able to identify from those 27 to 30 month and 4 to 5 year visits was this quite dramatic difference in the proportion of children and young people with developmental concerns that were at least one developmental concern which were identified by health visitors. And you can see there for those in the 27 to 30 month visit, that was nearly twice the proportion compared to the general population, and for the 4 to 5 year visit, nearly 3 times the proportion of the general population. So really highlighting significantly greater incidence of developmental concerns amongst the population who experience kinship care, formal kinship care, than the general population. As I said earlier, a lot of these numbers, we were interested in their experiences from experiencing kinship care onwards, but a large number of children and young people who subsequently experienced kinship care, we had the health data from before they had experience of kinship care. And when we looked at that data, we see that they had a slightly higher proportion actually with at least one concern at the 27 to 30 month visit, but not significantly higher. But overall, you can see that there's a clear picture there of need in relation to children and young people for support at those time points. And when we look at what those developmental concerns were, we can see there on the 27 to 30 month and the 4 to 5 year visit, we've got emotional and behavioral difficulties being prevalent, speech and language and communication issues, and vision issues. So again, we had a lot of data there, as well as the personal and social difficulties. And the reason you're seeing percentages on one side and 1 in 5s in the other side is some of that statistical disclosure control that Iain talked about in relation to the 5 safes and making sure that we have safe outputs. Because the numbers are so low in the 4 to 5 year visit, we try and make sure that they're very much unidentifiable. So we can see a real commonality actually though in the needs or the developmental concerns that were identified during that. So across our research, we found that we identified that kinship families in health and in other contexts in the education as well had complex needs, and that there are tailored supports needed to meet them and to help the children and families flourish. We also identified a significant variation across Scotland, and we need to understand better why that is occurring. It's really important to note that in no way does this research imply causality between kinship care and the difficulties which are experienced. We know that the impacts of trauma or ACEs on young people can be lifelong, and it's very, very likely that any negative experiences have their roots in earlier experiences than before they were taken into kinship care. And also, of course, the data doesn't cover the COVID-19 pandemic. Our data goes up to 2019, and that just highlights the need for timely data to be ingested and made available to researchers in order to really understand the context that we currently live in, rather than the context, well, 5 years ago, nearly 6 years ago now. And we also highlight that there's a need to better understand the circumstances of those who live informally in kinship care. So that is to say, those who are not looked after by local authority, but rather are living with family and friends informally, because that we understand is a much less understood cohort in terms of number and needs. And in relation to that second question about the feasibility and utility of the approach, we identified that, of course, linking to health and other data, administrative data, can provide really critical insights into the experiences of specific cohorts of young people. So obviously, some of the advantages of administrative data here really shine through in terms of it being population-wide, being able to identify longitudinal trends, and of course, that it doesn't place a burden on people to provide this information. It's collected systematically. And I think that alongside this project, the CHIC study led by Miriam Alec at the University of Glasgow is a really good example. They got a lot of health data involved in that study as well, and shows the power that you can, the power of linking this data together to tell a story and to make learning and knowledge about young people's experiences. But it's important, as Iain there talking about weeks in getting data is amazing. That sounds that shocks me in a very good way. The time for our project was a significant factor in terms of accessing the data, and it was a really it took us a long time in terms of the data being ingested and processes, but that is an area of constant improvement, and it has developed dramatically since we started this project. Obviously, linkage rates vary significantly, and again, that 0 to 5 year is a really critical area for us. It makes up more than 30% of children and young people who are becoming looked after, so clearly a cohort that we're really interested in. And this kind of flaw in the data, systemic data, makes that really challenging for us. And some of those different start date timeframes for different data mean that it's difficult to draw to do consistent analysis across longer periods of time. But we know that as the holdings improve, they continue to grow, they continue to be updated. The feasibility and utility of their data in a wide range of circumstances really continues to increase, and we're excited to carry on doing some of this work with administrative data in relation to children and young people who have experience of the care system. So if you want to know more about our individual research board, we have a report, and we also created an info comic for children and young people, for families, and anyone else who would like to absorb that information in that way. And those are all available via that QR code. And there's Joanna and my contact details if you would like to get in contact with us. Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing.
Great talk, both of you. Yes, it's superb. Yeah, do people have any questions? You can either just put in the chat if you're shy, or just open your mic, ask the question right away. I saw there was a question from Stephen Powell, but already answered by Ian. I think the question was about nursing midwifery council register, whether it can be linked to CHI. Basically, for people who don't know CHI basically is kind of just like NHS number, but it's for Scotland, it's called CHI. So, which means that if you can link in that way, you can link to healthcare dataset. Ian said it's working on that, basically. Ian, do you want to add a bit more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, the Nursing Midwifery Council, like I say, we've been working for quite a number of years with them. They've become very enthusiastic and big supporters of this work. They see the value of it to their work and more broadly. So they're very keen to see this data made available across the UK. The data is UK-wide, so you can do analysis of Scottish data within the integrated data service with Office for National Statistics. But at the moment, you can't link to the Scottish census or other Scottish data sets. So for that reason, we are working with the Nursing Midwifery Council and with Research Data Scotland. And I certainly hope that in the medium term, we will make the NMC data available within the Scottish Safe setting. And I would hope, and these are aspirations at the moment, but I would hope that it would be CHI seeded so that you can link to other data sets. I think, for example, trying to understand the health of nurses, I think the potential is huge, and Scottish health data, as I'm sure you all know, is excellent. So yeah, it's certainly an aspiration. It's certainly something we're working towards, and hopefully in the medium term, it's something we'll realise.
Thanks. Great. I have a very general question. For these data sets you both described, some of the studies you have done, or all the effort put in to link this focus on robust study, link kinship data to all the different types of data. I'm sure a lot of effort have been put in there. If people are interested to use this data for their own research, is there any way people can start with? Or is there any way you can help facilitating access without people going the same kind of difficult process you have done?
I mean, I'm not sure if I can be of any use whatsoever. However, the data sets that we accessed were those that have already now been linked to the spine. So that does make future data access much more straightforward. And I think that's particularly important in our study in relation to the SCRA data. So the Scottish Children's Reporters Administration is a kind of non-governmental organization that they're kind of funded by the government. They fulfill a government role really, but they're not actually the government, and so they have their own data holding, and alongside Permanently Progressing, we were one of our first projects to actually link that data in to the spine, and we got assent from SCRA to retain that linkage that was done, so that would speed up any future linkage requests that included those children or young people and SCRA data. So that was certainly something that we, I guess, a support that we left behind in the wake of our project to others who might come and be interested in using the SCRA data, which is a super interesting data set. And I would encourage others to look into what's held in it because it is really interesting. Yeah, and I think that SCADR and ADR Scotland generally are doing a lot of work to make sure that the process is much more straightforward and streamlined now. We were starting ours back in, I think, 2019 or 2020, we put in our first requests. So, you know, we were under a system which was really being developed, and now it's much more advanced, and we are, I'm sure, much more smoother and straightforward, and certainly Iain's experience seems to reflect that.
Thanks.
If I can maybe just add to that, yes, I popped a link in the chat area to the integrated data service. And that provides information on accessing not just the NMC census data set, but lots of other data sets that are held there. And I would really just reiterate what Robert was saying there, that, you know, the work that we're doing, it's some 10 years since we started talking towards to the NMC. But now we're in a position with that specific data set and other data sets within the integrated data set, much smoother process. So anybody that's interested in that data, actually it's worthwhile looking at just what data they hold there. It's a really valuable resource, and it's certainly also, you know, where we're moving, that ease of access to data for approved projects is definitely where Scotland's trying to move to as well. So yeah, we're getting there, I think.
Super. Any questions from the audience? What people are thinking, I have a question for Iain. I think you mentioned a very kind of fascinating phenomenon, right? You know, on the one hand, 50% of the nursing vacancies were filled by the you know, overseas professionals. On the other hand, some of the new nurses we trained here it's hard to find a job. So does that data somehow potentially can give us some insights, actionable in terms of how to fill the gap?
Yes, I mean, certainly that's our intention, and certainly one of the aims of the work that we're doing. The fact that it's longitudinal data, the fact that it's also, you know, one of the big powers of administrative data is the numbers are very large, and so you can take forward geographical analysis and you can see the differences between one part of the country and another part of the country. So I think it can help us to understand, you know, where there are situations where there's lots of nurses qualifying, potentially not finding jobs, and other parts of the country where there are fewer vacancies. And that can begin to help us think about policies to overcome that. It also enables us to think temporally. So are there areas where geographical areas that experience too many qualifying at one point in time, and then some years later whether are insufficient? And it can help us think about, well, and I don't know if this is an answer, we need to do a lot of thinking, a lot of economic analysis, but, you know, are you better off providing people with jobs so that, you know, they can be beginning to establish themselves in their careers, developing the experience? We know from a lot of research that there are links between having experienced nurses and patient outcomes. So, you know, are you better off employing nurses even though, you know, you don't actually have absolute need for them so that you can save money in the long term. I don't know the answer to that, but my hope is that our analysis can begin to shed light on that. But again, that's all for the future. I suppose the other thing that I would add, I think there's been an interesting situation in Northern Ireland where there were cuts to training places, and the government from the Republic of Ireland has stepped in. One of the newspaper headlines highlighted that. And I think that highlights, I mean, the reason why the Republic of Ireland stepped in to fund those places is because they recognise that many people who train in Northern Ireland actually end up working within the Republic. And I suspect that there are similar geographical differences across the UK. So again, and especially the work we're doing looking at internal migration across the UK can really help us to understand, you know, might you be better off expanding training places in one place to a greater extent than you expand training places in another place. So I think there's lots of ways in which we potentially can begin to think much more creatively, both from a research perspective, but also importantly from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the longitudinal nature as well as the linkable nature of this kind of data to different types of data. For example, if we can link the health data set at a national level, kind of really near real time, you can potentially have a kind of prediction model to say what's the skill competence shortage in 6 months, 1 year. I don't know whether you have observed things like the COVID hit. Definitely, we need a big gap in terms of managing these people. It's a new disease, new virus in ICU, that kind of stuff. If we can predict that, actually can be, you know, what going to happen for the workforce requirement and where to fill the gaps using all the data available. Yeah, I think the data actually is very, very valuable in that sense.
I completely agree. And again, one of the strengths of administrative data is that it is event data. So it's not just data at one point in time. So you can look at, you know, the dynamics, how things are changing. My research training is in demography, so you can also project forward as well. So I think that I mean, I'm biased, but I think the data is hugely powerful to help us understand workforce and the complexities of workforce.
Yeah, certainly. Any questions from the audience? If we don't ask, I'm going to ask the next question. Yeah, any questions, people? Any comments? I think it's amazing data set. Okay. I'm not joking. I'm going to ask Robert another question. So for the kinship care, do we know the reasons or information available in this, why they got in the kinship care as first place? Then you potentially can pinpoint why that, they have three times more likely, of course your data is kind of small in 45 years, linkage, but it's kind of first, it's shocking. Look at the statistics, right? It's got three times more.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's three times more than the general population. We do know that the care experience population do have greater needs, and in general. So what we weren't able to do in this particular study, because of the way we designed it, was to look at them compared to other looked after children and young people, which might be also an interesting comparison to see where they fall in relation to that and their relation to them. However, yeah, one of the ever ongoing frustrations as a researcher in this area is that the data doesn't contain information on the reasons for children and young people becoming looked after or being made the subject of a child protection order or anything like that. That is some of the data that is held tangentially within the Scottish Children's Reporter Administration data, that SCRA data that I was talking about. But that is not a part of the core return that local authorities make to government. And that is, a problem. That data at present isn't to the best of my understanding, coded at all. It is held within case notes, and there may be some indications. For instance, if a child or young person is you can see in their history has a experience of a child protection order, for example, or something like that, then you can make some certain you may be able to find some information about them in that way. But there is no systemic recording of that, so we can't see whether whether a child or young person goes into kinship care perhaps because their parents become incapacitated and unable to care for them in a physical sense, whether it is because of neglect, whether it's they're an unaccompanied asylum seeking, well, not a child, or they find somebody like that, that none of that data is actually recorded. The technical is recorded, and again, like in a lot of the work that the Promise are doing, I think, at the moment is trying to get beyond the data that the system is good at recording. The system records data which is useful for the system, and it does that very well. And that's about number of placements and where they are and when they start and when they finish and things like that. But the meaning data, the bit about, well, why was that and what were the experiences of that, is not data that is well recorded at all. Even in the social care data, where we might really be, specifically interested in that data exactly. So hopefully that is, again, an area where the government and the Promise Scotland are interested to develop our capacity and our ability to actually look at that kind of thing on a systemic level. But at present, that's not possible. And so we can't say, we don't know why these children and young people are becoming looked after, or whether that's any different from the general population, about which we have some very general information, but nothing specific. So you can't tie it to experiences, which is a real problem, a shortcoming.
Thanks. I think technically it's doable, right? Sorry, I think actually there's a question. Jocelyn, do you want to just ask the question?
Sure. Is it possible, and is there appetite for documenting kind of the quirks of the data set in either using it, linking it, to make it easier for researchers down the line when you say, I've read the documentation, I expect, what you expect and what you find are often quite different. And it's having used other data sets, I would have preferred to know this before putting the application funding, spending the time on linkage, etc. So is there appetite? If so, how do we go about kind of that process?
Yeah, I don't know, Iain or Robert, who do you want?
I mean, I would, Joanna, who's the co-author on the project with me, has written a response which I think encapsulated very well. Yes, that information is invaluable, right? In planning and in understanding what data you're going to get. And that has been improving, and I think the metadata documents and the documentation that SCADR and ADR UK and Scotland are producing around the data sets is invaluable, and it seems like the obvious place to store it, right? Like, that seems like in the metadata there about linkage capacity or something like that, or quirks or however you might label it. I think that would be hugely important.
I'll just very, very briefly add to that, just to reiterate really everything that Robert said there. I should say that the NMC census dataset is an example of what ADR UK refer to as flagship datasets. These are datasets that are pre-linked, they're held in the integrated data service. And that comes with documentation, again, and you'll find on the website devoted to it. I'll pop a link in the chat in a moment. But that has a lot of documentation, including policy, key policy questions that perhaps might be addressed, but also information on the data itself, on numbers, on where the linkage is stronger or weaker. And so, yes, again, this is an evolving process, but it's certainly something that you're absolutely right. That's key information if you're going to use that data set. You need to know it before you're really beginning to apply for the data. And so that's certainly something that we're looking to put in place, as Robert says, with metadata, and in some instances with more formal with flagship data sets with supporting documentation.
Thanks, Lon. I think on that note, we're just 1 minute, overall, that's great. Serena, do you want anything?
Nope. Thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Iain. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everyone for joining. That's great. I think this will be shared.